Sir David Farragut. Well, what can I say about him? Rather like Mahan, the bits that are known of him do not amount to the full part of him. He is far richer, far more interesting, far more capable of providing a good example of leadership than realistically he's known as. In fact, the amount of people who don't even know Dan the Torpedo's full speed ahead is attributed to him. And there's a whole debate around that quote. Whole debate around it, but certainly was something, like he was saying. I'll get into that debate later on. And still use part or even the full quote has never not surprised me. I might be old-fashioned. I believe if I'm going to quote someone, I should know who I'm quoting. Although I did have to say, it has caused me fun in the past, because I once had a student who was very, very anti-communism. They definitely believed left-wing was wrong in all politics. And their life quote, which they thought was a brilliant life quote, and they didn't realise who it was Lenin. I think when I explained that to them, it caused a minor disturbance in the force, but we'll leave that to one side. The point is, Farragut is a very cool and interesting character who has an extensive career in the US Navy. He served a long time. Technically, I think there's a debate out there, but I think you could argue he's got the longest service record of pretty much any officer who served in the US Navy on active duty. Because he served from 1810 to 1870. So 60 years. And considering many of the last years were the US Civil War, it's not like you can go, well, he was a senior officer, so he was kept in service as an advisor, but he wasn't doing anything. No, his most famous actions all come in the last decade of his life. He is a man who serves quietly, but with honour and virtue, and I would say a good portion of luck, for 50 years. 50 years. Before he starts to get any kind of credit. And those are in actions which, frankly, sometimes he gets to express his strategic capabilities, sometimes his tactical capabilities, and sometimes it's absolute stubborn force of will comes forward. Now, he's not perfect. Please note, I am not going to be sitting here claiming any person is a perfect leader in this year of leadership. I'm not going to claim anyone's a perfect person, because guess what? Perfect people don't exist. They only ever turn up on Instagram and in various other forms of social media where people are going, look at how perfect my life is. Because real people are human. And humans are innately flawed individuals. Both as a person and collective. So there are flaws. But I think often the great leaders out there are people who have learnt to embrace their flaws and use them, to accept them, to know them, to account for them in their operations and work with them where they help, find ways to mitigate them, usually staff, I would argue, it's often the first choice of this one, when they can't. Farragut is also a product of his system. He's a product of the familial politics and familial promotion which goes on in this period, which provides people with experience. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's not the methodology we would do today, but to be fair, you also wouldn't be sending children to sea at 9 today to serve. So there are a lot of differences. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily bad, because in a time period where you don't have the education system you have today, you don't have the internet, you don't have the ability to go and gather information, and you don't have the life expectancy and health expectancy that you have today, starting off early in service is probably the best way you have of getting someone who's actually going to be skilled at the job. And the thing is, you're not probably going to trust that someone to any that 9-year-old to anyone. You're going to trust them to someone who you believe will take care of their interests. And that's probably going to be family. And let's be honest, it serves the people who they're entrusted to as well, because if you're able to bring into your entourage successful officers, successful personalities who are going to grow up to become legacies and follow you, and later when you maybe achieve fleet command, they'll command the ships in your fleet and all these things, that's a good thing. It gives you honor. It brings honor to you. Their service, their honor multiplies your honor. So it's a win-win situation if it works. And if it works, you get people like David Glasgow Farragut. That's a good thing. Especially when America really needed them. Really did need these officers. Really did need these capabilities. Now, his first time going to sea was with his adoptive father. Now, he came to have his adoptive father because, well, his mother died. And his father, who was born Geordie Farragut Mesquita, who died in 1817, had been born in 1755, though. His mum died in 1808. So you think about that, his dad is 53, just lost his wife, he's got some young children, but he's got no one else, no other relatives in the world. During the American Revolutionary War, the War for Independence, he'd served alongside a guy called Porter, and he'd been basically the closest thing he had to brother by another mother, to use that phrase. And he's introduced by Porter when he meets up with him to his son, David. David is a young naval officer. He has a family, has a wife. He's in the career that Mesquita had been in, now Farragut. He's in that career. The career he wants his son to follow him on. So he asks David to adopt his son, to take him into his family. The son, at this point, is called James, by the way. He would take on the name David in 1812, while his father was still alive, but when he goes off to serve aboard the USS Essex. It's honour of his foster father. He'd already served at sea with him since 1810. So by the time the War of 1812 and USS Essex comes about and he's at sea with him, he's already been at sea for nearly 3 years. 1810, 1811, and into 1812. He has experience. As much as a midshipman of that many years will ever do. He comes from a naval family. He's getting a naval education. And he's been joined into another naval family. And his father didn't just give him this connection, didn't just put him to David Porter, who I already covered in another video, the Battle of Valparaiso, about my views on him and his leadership skills. He has some. He does have some. He has some great political skills, some great politing ability. I'm not quite sure about his higher strategic command and ability to actually coordinate with forces, but in the nicest way, that isn't me, and that isn't someone in glass houses throwing stones. That's just saying that he's again human. He has some good points, he has some bad points. I'm not a big fan of him because of how he acts after Valparaiso. And how he sort of justifies himself afterwards. If he carried on the same vein, I'd have thought I'd probably rate him as one of the better frigate commanders of the War of 1812, 1814. His conduct after the Battle of Valparaiso, how he behaves himself, just makes it go. But the thing is, David Farragut gets to see all this from up close. He gets to see it up close in a way that the man is his father, his benefactor, but he's his adopted father. And he's a Farragut, not a Porter. And I always think, in many ways, Farragut sees what David Porter Sr. does and learns from it. He takes the good things from it, but not everything from it. And he will do this throughout his career. He will serve under many exceptional officers in many exceptional places. He is a very well-connected, very lucky officer. And if the US Navy had been any bigger, had been any more well-funded, any sort of better supported, then his career would have been very different. He'd have been far more senior, far earlier. And he probably would have been an admiral before the Civil War even started. And that's down to Congress, the fact he isn't. That is entirely on Congress. Not wishing to have a large navy, not wishing to have a large army, wishing to do all sorts of things with them, as we'll be getting into this, but not really wanting to support it. It's like someone who has a credit card but wishes to only have a small limit on it, and then keeps complaining, "Oh, I keep running out." You want to put everything on your credit card? You want to go everywhere, do everything on it? Yeah, that's great. But if you only have a small limit, you need to keep paying, and you can't keep complaining. You have to keep paying it off. It's a fiscal system to do, by the way. Personally, as I've said before, the only reason I got a credit card was to pay for myself, in order to fund the research necessary for me to put a book together. That was it. Otherwise, wouldn't have one. Because it's just something else you need to manage in life. But that's me. This is a history channel, not a financial advice channel. Apart from if you're a government, then the financial advice is spend more on your navy. Okay? That's a consistent financial advice. With his service as a midshipman beginning, and him serving through the 1812-14 war and getting experience there, that gives him a leg up. That gives him an ability. And He is at the Battle of Essex versus HMS Alert. He's at the Battle of Valparaiso. He takes part in all those. In Valparaiso, he's wounded in action and made a prisoner of war. He will take part in West Indies anti-piracy operations, the Mexican-American War, and of course the American Civil War. But he has a lot of experience. And it starts here. And honestly, it also starts with a round the world voyage, pretty much. He's doing so many voyages around South America, around the world. He gets a lot of navigation experience, and this is going to be something which we're going to talk about a lot with Farragut as we go through his career. He has a lot of navigation experience, a lot of ship handling experience, and that pays into how he runs his ships, but also the decisions he makes in battles. And this navigation continues on with, well, he's deployed to the USS Independence, which is one of their very few ships of the line, proper ships of the line, and USS Macedon, in the Mediterranean. At this point, he is deployed outside the family in some ways, but it's sort of normal for families to share. They basically go, right then, this person served under me, I've trained them up, I now have to send them to you, because they have to pass their lieutenant's exam, these things, and therefore it's easier if they go with you. And the thing is, Independence comes into service after the war is over, pretty much. She's launched on 22nd of June, 1814. She's commissioned long enough after that frankly, the war is over. This is the true scenario of wars. If you go into war and you start a crash build program of warships, you will probably get those ships in about 2 years' time. At the earliest. No matter what you do. It'll be about 2 years because of how long it takes to assemble and organize and build certain things, and there's just the sheer setting of the metal and the actual acquisition of all the materials you need. It'll be 2 years at the earliest. Larger ships will take even longer. This is one of the fun things which often happens when we go through history and we start talking about things like the Flower Class and all the crash build programs people talk about and go, well, look, at this point, they deliver earlier than the 2 year mark, and you go, those were all ordered prior to World War II. The Flower Class, Hunt Class escort destroyers, and all these things, they're ordered prior to World War II beginning. So the long lead items are started before the war begins. So yeah, they're quick to come into service. But they still take roughly 2 years. And this time he's serving under Commodore William Bainbridge, and Captain William Crane. And he learns from them. He really does. He spends enough time on Independence that he's learning another style of command. And Bainbridge has a different style of approach than Porter. Bainbridge is far more of a... Well, actually, Bainbridge is far better at working in a group. This is the thing. Porter's, as said, is a fairly decent ship commander and a fairly good politician. He's not very good at fleet command and fleet operations, and you see this comes up repeatedly again. And it's one of the ongoing problems for navies. You can produce people, you're training them up, you need them to be good at ship command, and that's what they go through the first pretty much 20 years of their service orientated around commanding a ship. That's what they're being trained for, because that's going to be important. And then you suddenly have someone to command multiple ships. And all the lessons they've learnt in commanding an individual ship, they've got to now play into commanding a group of them. And it's different. And sometimes some people can make that jump and some people can't. That's the way it goes. Bainbridge is better than Porter. Bainbridge is a far better fleet commander and force commander than Porter will be. And this is where, in the Mediterranean, Farragut really starts to learn these things. He really starts to learn and improve himself. And it's serving on a ship of the line. This is a prestigious posting. This is a posting which many people would kill for. And frankly, for Porter, it's an advantage getting his adopted son into this, because that's going to reflect well on him. And then he gets to serve on a frigate. But also, before he comes home, well, he gets to spend 9 months 9 months in Tunis, learning more ashore about navigation. Basically, the place which is second only to the UK to go to learn about navigation at this point, he spends 9 months in Tunis. It's also useful for the Americans for them to do that because, well, if you're training up your naval officers to know the world and to be able to navigate around the world, they need to go to where some of the mapping centres in the world are. And Tunis is one of the great navigation mapping centres of the world. Especially important if you want to train officers to do cartography and oceanography in terms of mapping out the world. After this, he returns and serves as a lieutenant aboard the USS Shark. He has a year aboard her. She's a good schooner. Potentially longer. There is a debate because, let me put it this way. We know in 1823 he moves on to another ship. We know he's assigned to the Shark in USS in 1819. We know she isn't technically commissioned till launch till 1821. So, she was built in the Washington Navy Yard, but she would have had naval personnel attached to her during her construction, watching construction, and being part of it. And my running theory for her is that Farragut was sent back and immediately assigned to her as a junior officer, watching her construction, and was probably involved in some decisions made during her construction thanks to his experience in the Essex, his experience in the Mediterranean, his experience at Tunis. And it's another way of assessing a junior officer's abilities. And then, when she goes to sea, he's part of the first crew. He's a lieutenant aboard her. He's not with her for long, though. Again, not unsurprising. He transfers quite quickly, in 1823, to the Ferret. Now, this is important, because being given the Ferret, well, that allows him to join the Mosquito Fleet and fight pirates in the Caribbean Sea, as well as doing all sorts of other operations, all sorts of other duties. Now, Ferret was one of the 8 critical shallow draft schooners which had been assigned to Porter's squadron. Now, Porter was given 16 vessels. And this force was going to be operating alongside the Royal Navy. It was a combined operation. It was a combined operation to deal with the West Indies piracies, to deal with the Caribbean threat. And whilst there is often a lot made of the American forces, the British forces are just as important. And in many ways, they are working together. They are working in tandem. There is often a scenario of the British are operating here, so the pirates move there. Oh, they find the Americans. The Americans are operating there, which causes the pirates to try and move to avoid. And then suddenly, what do you know? There was a British ship here, and it wasn't doing anything until we arrived. It's amazing what's going on here. There is a level of interoperation which is truly, truly beautiful, and truly does, again, you have to remember, this is 1823. This is not just within living memory of the most recent war between Britain and America. It's within the service memory of the people. The people involved leading the war on the American side were the people who were fighting the British. And the people leading it on the British side were the people involved in fighting the Americans. And they're working together very happily. Which either says a lot for the professionalism of the naval officers involved, or even more for the fact that they really didn't care about the politics. They were just there to do a job. We'll leave that to one side. But again, diplomacy is going to places here. And there is a lot of diplomacy. David Porter is doing a lot of work. He's actually good at this point. He is a Commodore, but this plays to his strength, because in many ways this is a series of single ship actions, not of fleet work. It's not having to combine ships working together. It's having to have lots of ships off doing individual things. Now, this is often an interesting point to make when we're talking about leadership. The difference between I want to combine ships together, working together to achieve a single goal, versus I have this list of goals, I have this list of ships, I want to assign the right ship to the right goal. Those are different skill sets. Some people have both skill sets, and they're great, but some people have one and some people have the other. Some people can be strategic leadership, can be in charge of sending out fleets and sending out commanders of their fleets and do really great work at that level, but should never be actually in command of those fleets themselves. Because once it comes to controlling all the different forces together, they get very fixated on the ship they're on. Some people, if they want to be a strategic command, need to be as far removed from the actual fighting and actual command as possible, because their tendency will be to start trying to micromanage what they're on and focus in on that. That is Porter's problem. That, and, as said before, there is a reason why the Mosquito Fleet and various other scenarios tend to write out a lot of the history of the British involvement. Because Porter likes to talk about all the glory being his and pretend no one else is there other than him. And doesn't like anything which doesn't fit the narrative. David Porter. Proof that unfortunately David Beatty wasn't a one-off. Maybe it's with the name David. No, there have been actually some, including Farragut, there have been some very good Davids who were naval officers, so it's not David. DP? DB, maybe? Not sure. Anyway, but then there's the next David Porter, who's David Porter's son, who's very, very good. And very honourable. So, yeah, it's just the individuals. It really is. I do love the fact that the American schooners were called Ferret, Beagle, Fox, Greyhound, Jackal, Terrier, Weasel, and Wildcat. It's rather cute. Anyway. So, Farragut gets command of the Ferret. And it's his first independent command. And I cannot emphasize that enough. I know I've already said it, but I cannot emphasize it enough. Now, her primary roles were transporting sailors, marines, and basically all the supplies they needed along the coast of Cuba and to surrounding places to support operations. He does have fun during a stopover in Nassau. It turns out one of his crewmen, who he didn't realize had been, was a deserter from the Royal Navy. Now, this crewman then compounded issues because they decided they didn't like the American ship, so they hailed a British ship and asked to be removed from the Ferret. Farragut learns of this, and Farragut thinks, I'm going to engage in some diplomacy. And he does. He does some very good, interesting diplomacy, because he does make sure that that young man gets to where he wants to go. Disciplines the sailor, and turns it over to the British authorities in Nassau. So, yes, they got to go to the British, but they got to go straight to the authorities. Rather than hanging himself, well, let's be honest, the British were fairly good at making examples of deserters in those days. You could earn prize money, you could earn pay, you would get fed and watered, and you had certain level of expectations of employment rights aboard a warship. You desert from a warship, a lot of those protections go away very quickly. The protections of tradition and actual rules goes away incredibly quickly. This actually earned him quite a lot of praise, because he handled it in a way which both didn't suggest the British were being treated as the overlords or anything like that. He wasn't assiduously handing this person over. If the person hadn't tried to claim he was British, he might have even got away with it. As it was, the fact that the guy was a deserter already annoyed him. He didn't like desertion. But he could have accepted it if the man had proved loyal and said, I'm American now. I deserted to join the American Navy because I believed your cause was just. That sort of thing. That could probably have been got away with. Would have been allowed. Would have been fine. But it's the re-ratting. You can rat. Anyone can rat. It's ratting a second time that always gets you into trouble. I can't think of many who've managed to re-rat in history. I think Winston Churchill was one of the few, when jumping from the Conservatives to the Liberals and back to Conservatives again. Farragut did well for her, and she received multiple tours. Multiple tours. And then after he'd served on her for a while, well, he then goes and does other opportunities. He'd been serving on Greyhound before he got Ferret. But after he'd been on Greyhound, he got sent to the Experiment, which was a whole nother kettle of fish. And again, more sailing training, because the Experiment was an interesting sailor. She was a very interesting sailor. And Farragut always seems to be seeking out these chances to learn, these chances to understand things, to develop his own skills, which is rather lucky. Rather lucky. Now, he would spend the next few years going through different ships. The Brandywine is a good example. Now, the Brandywine is on another diplomatic mission. Originally, she was supposed to be known as the Susquehanna. I'm going to pronounce it as, and I hope that was correct. Susquehanna. Looks like quite correct. But she's renamed because she's taking Marquis de Lafayette home. He'd been on a tour of the United States. He's the surviving French general of the Revolutionary War, the man who'd helped the U.S. Army. He'd done all sorts of things. They were trying to get him home safely. And so they selected officers who came from as many states as possible, and where possible, were descendants of persons who distinguished themselves in the American Revolution. Hence Farragut's picked, because, let's be honest, Farragut's dad, both his dad and his adoptive dad, had fought in the American Revolution. It was useful. Or rather, his dad and his adoptive dad's dad, actually. So his adoptive grandfather? Yeah, his adoptive grandfather had both fought in the American Revolution War. Sorry about that one. Seriously, that family tree keeps confusing me a bit, but it's starting to turn in what I would... No, I won't say that. But there is a part of... There's a part of Cornwall where sometimes family trees are considered a bit of a circle. And there's parts of there's parts of all sorts of places around where you have it. This is a joke in the area that places the family trees are circles. Well, yeah, his family tree really does start to look like a circle at certain points. It's so interconnected. It was a pretty good trip. They survived a nice storm, but that's good. That gives them sailing altitude. But honestly, the biggest storm was waiting for them, because, of course, France was now under the rule of the very non-revolutionary King Charles X. Not revolutionary inclined at all, really, was Charlie Boy X. He truly didn't feel... There are some very interesting descriptions around him, but I'm not sure how you can be a non-royalist king. Some people say he's a passionately royalist king. I'd say most kings are passionately royalist, after all. That's kind of them being passionate about them holding on to a job and their necks normally in this period. So I can't imagine you would find a king who was not passionate about being a royalist in this period. If you can think of a king in this period who was not passionate about being royal and being a king, please put the suggestions in the comments. But the thing is, they turn up, they worry about the reception. Nope. The captain goes ashore, spends a few months touring France to have a look at the shipyards, ship design on their millers and other things, and see what he can learn. And by all accounts, Farragut gets to wander along a bit with him. And Lafayette has a perfectly acceptable meeting in France. He has a perfectly acceptable time. Now, after this, he goes and spends some time again with the Mediterranean squadron. And while he's in the while he's there, well, he basically jumps around vessels. He spends the next decade or so, from 1825 to about 1838, being usually first lieutenant on slightly larger vessels, but doing a few other roles as well, getting experience, getting a lot of experience. Before, in 1838, he's placed in command of the Erie, a sloop of war. Now, the Erie is a cool vessel. It truly is. And him getting to commander, that just gives him a chance of getting more experience. It really does. This is what she looks like. She'd been launched in 1813. She is only recently commissioned from Ordinary. Cruising the Atlantic coast, trying to track down merchant vessels and any vessel she might find in distress, having a bad time. She was there to go back and up. Basically, she was doing a role which required a really good sailing officer. Because it's one thing to get your own ship for a storm. It's quite another to, in a storm, be able to assist others without endangering your ship. You have to be someone who's a very trusted, very experienced sailor. Which probably explains why in 1841 he's promoted to the rank of commander. And then, well, the Mexican-American War comes. He hasn't had that much experience in the meantime. He's still been wandering around from ships where he can. But before we'll get into that, it's Shameless Book Plug time. Now, normally when I do a Shameless Book Plug, I'll sit here and I'll talk about saying thank you to everyone for watching this channel. And I'm going to. Thank you. Thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you for making everything I do possible. But I'm also going to do something else. This is the year of the leadership. And some of the leaders I'm going to talk about are going to be very popular. The videos are automatically going to do well. Farragut is one of those who might already do well. Might not. I might do a terrible presentation, in which case they won't do well. But the fact is, some people are famous enough that usually their name is going to attract a certain amount of views. You do an okay job, you still get a certain amount of views. And if I was a sensible YouTuber, I would concentrate on the people who would bake me in a certain level of audience, and use that to build my channel, because hopefully enough of those people who watch that big fun name of the person I'm talking about would then watch my other videos and subscribe and grow, and that's how you grow it. Luckily, I'm not a sensible YouTuber. I really am not. So I've done a year of leadership, and that year of leadership includes people like Effingham, like... There are a few of us to come, but if I say it before they even get there, then it's definitely tempting fate. People who were actually involved in some very important events, but are not famous of themselves at all. It's always one of those funny things. It's kind of like Jellicoe and Beatty, but even more extreme. Beatty is more well known than Jellicoe is, but Jellicoe is well known enough that he doesn't get completely overshadowed. If I start talking about Drake, people go, the Armada. Drake wasn't in command of the English fleet of the Armada. That was Effingham. And what I find really interesting is if you actually look at the books of this period, which we've been talking about, the period when we're talking about in terms of history of the American Civil War, of the Royal Navy of a similar time period, that's sort of covered by this book, which is Naval Administration by Richard Percy Hamilton, former First Sea Lord. This is my copy of that book. You find actually in this period, Effingham is more well known. You see, the thing is, what's changed? What changed? What meant that suddenly now Drake's more well known? Well, if you want to cast for a movie, do you want to cast for a dashing man who circumnavigates the world and is a bit of a roguish privateer / pirate? Or do you want to cast for a lord who spends a lifetime being trained to command at sea, who serves as a diplomat, a lawyer, various other duties on behalf of the crown? It's obvious, isn't it? If you're going to write a play, you're going to write about Drake. If you're going to do a movie, you're going to do it about Drake. One of them is a very cool character and a very cool story to visually show on screen. The other one is to me more important, but it's not a cool story to tell. But there are similarities between Effingham and Farragut, which is why I'm doing this in Farragut's video, and why Farragut's video, getting delayed as it has been by me not being happy with it, has given me this opportunity to add this in. Farragut has to lead a very interesting formation, which is often full of a lot of people who are not naval officers. When you look back through history, the closest he's got in predecessor is not the American War of Independence, because, let's be honest, they're not putting together a fleet there. Not the War of 1812 either, which he had his own personal experience of. They don't have a fleet then. The closest is probably you have to go back to the English fleet in versus the Spanish Armada. They're a force of privateers. The Navy Royal, the Royal ships, account for less than 30 of the 160 ships for most of the operation. There's sort of 34 Royal ships that are in the operation the whole way through. At various points they come in, and he said, Eric, so yeah, that's quite a small group. The rest of them, they're privateers. And Effingham turns that into an effective fleet. He gets that to work together as an effective fleet. Think about how difficult that is to get to happen. To get that many individuals to work together. And it's the same for Farragut. He has got an extremely high level of experience, understanding, and knowledge behind him. He has served for so many years by the time the American Civil War breaks out, as we just was discussing in this point in the video now. But his counterparts, most of his contemporaries, most of the people working alongside him, most of the people who are junior to him, who are running his ships and doing all that, they're not. They don't have that experience. They haven't trained in navigation. They haven't had the experience he's had. And one of the things you find interesting is he often ends up having to do the stuff himself. Why? Because honestly, he hasn't got anyone else he can trust with the job. With Effingham, when he tries to delegate, well, his senior officers are sufficiently, how do I put this, sure of themselves and their own brilliance, that they will completely make up their own rules sometimes, unless he couches it or picks them in the correct way to make sure that this benefits them, that what they're being asked to do plays into what they are good at, what they're naturally inclined to do. What I'm saying is, they're interesting videos to put next to each other, and if you've watched one, I hope you watch the other. Now, this is an interesting point of the career for Farragut, because both he and Perry have been trained by Bainbridge. Bainbridge was, of course, the Commodore for him in the Mediterranean, and Perry was serving underneath him. When Perry becomes a Commodore, Perry is very much carrying on the Bainbridge style of organization. And one of the things with the Mexican-American War is you have to remember there aren't that many ships activated. The US Navy does not do what we would call the full mobilization. They're not bringing everyone. Not everyone is in service is going to get a ship. Not everyone is going to get their chance for glory. And very much someone like Commodore Perry can pick who he wants from the American fleet, from the American forces. And he picks, because he trusts him, Farragut. He picks Farragut. And he uses Farragut for a lot of independent operations for his time down there. In fact, more often than not, Farragut is actually one of the ones trusted to be out of Perry's sight. So there's sort of a two-tier in terms of selection. The officers that Perry trusts to be down there, and the officers Perry trusts to not only be down there, but be acting out of his sight on their own cognizance. Those he trusts to make their own decisions and not cause him trouble. Because the Mexican-American War is an interesting challenge in diplomacy. Because America wants to fight it, but they don't want the European powers to get involved. America needs to fight it because of the issues with Mexico at the time, and because of the issues Mexico has with America at the time. But they don't want other powers getting involved. And if you misjudge things, you could quite easily give those other powers the casus belli they need to get involved, and there are other powers who would like to get involved. And one of the things you often have to consider about America is, whilst it always has the potential of being a massively powerful nation, until it's got the infrastructure in place to actually tie that nation together, and people can argue at different points when they actually have the infrastructure in place to tie it together and actually it's working. Some people put it to the organisation of the railways and them actually being in place, and some people use other dates. I would say the railways are definitely a good start in starting the process, but realistically, it's something which is probably not completed till the interwar period, the 1920s and 30s, because even having the railways, you need a level of infrastructure which links into the railways, which might sound strange, but yeah, the railways run from coast to coast, but are all the bits you need to be connected up in the middle connected up to them? And how well they connected up to the stations, and how well... And it takes time. It takes time to build the infrastructure you need. So America, at very much in this period, doesn't want outside powers getting involved, because most of them have a lot more infrastructure and a lot more capability and could probably outmass the United States. Certainly some of the major European powers could definitely outmass the United States in actual deployable power, combat power they could put in there. And again, you can also thank the US Congress for this, because they've got virtually no reserve of big warships, etc., to fall back on. They've got virtually nothing. So they haven't even been able to build up stuff they can use in peacetime. They would literally have to build it. And the thing is, the major European powers have got the stuff they've already built up, plus their own ability to build stuff, and the fact their governments have invested a lot more in infrastructure to support their navies. And we're also at a period when it's sort of the end-ish of the sailing period, when still sailing ships are still viable warships to an extent. And we've not yet reached the, I would say, the American Civil War marks, when the ironclad really goes, yeah, you're going to need to be us to really be a proper warship. We're still before that. Still before that. Anyway, he gets Saratoga. And she's a cute ship. She's a ship he likes. She's a sloop of the war. And she's a good vessel. And he departs from Norfolk on 29th of March, 1847. And when he gets to Veracruz, that's Mexico, on the 26th of April, 1847, just less than a month later, he reports to Perry and goes, "What do you want me to do?" And Perry, basically, after 3 days, is telling him, "Well, you've been on station. Your ship's obviously in good nick. You're obviously as good as I remember. Good. Bog off, then." "What do you mean, bog off?" "I want you to go 150 nautical miles away to blockade Tuxpan. And I want you to stay there as long as you can." So he goes there. Gets there on the April 30th. So a little over a day sailing away. And stays there to July the 12th. Then he returns to Veracruz to get resupplied. After he's been resupplied and restocked and done his duty and the other ships come in to relieve him, he then does a round trip to Tabasco, where he can restock some more and resupply his vessel. And he then after that he gets back to Veracruz on the August 11th, and guess what? Within a couple of weeks, he's off Tuxpan again. Pretty much, he stays there. That's his duty, to blockade Tuxpan solo. There's a outbreak of yellow fever aboard the ship. He keeps the ship in station. 2 months. Then returns to Veracruz, takes another month there, and then returns to Pensacola Navy Yard in Florida. And finally gets there on January 6th, 1848. That's where he disembarks his ill patients, his sick crew, replenishes stores, and finally makes it back to New York, where he commissioned her on February 19th, 1848. She would be decommissioned a week later. It's not unusual. It's not unusual. But the thing is, he'd done all that. He dealt with the trials and tribulations of being basically a solo blockading force. He dealt with a yellow fever outbreak on his ship. And he kept his ship on station. And pretty much the entire time, Perry didn't have him with his main fleet. He had him dispatched off doing other duties. Because Farragut was not someone that Perry needed to be watching the whole time to hold his hand and check he didn't do something stupid. Or get too aggressive. It's the classic thing. You have some very good naval commanders who are very, very aggressive. They're not the ones you want running free round while you're doing blockade duty. They will be the one in this certain area. They will be the ones who will cause trouble. You need them because if it turns into war fighting, you want them because they're the ones who'll go for the enemy's jugular quickly and efficiently. But you kind of want someone who's able to go, yeah, I have that side of my personality, but that side of the personality is going to be overparked until we need it. The side of personality that's going to be out is going to be my judicious cruiser officer personality. And that is a good thing. It's a sensible thing. And he does so well, he gets Mare Island Naval Shipyard. He gets to be the inaugural commander. He gets to set it up. We talk about him being the father of the US Navy. Well, without him, there isn't a Pacific Navy. Because he is literally the one sent to San Francisco, sent to build the US Navy in the Pacific. And he is sent there from his post as assistant inspector of ordnance in Norfolk, Virginia, to go to set up the infrastructure, set up the supply, set up everything they need at Mare Island Naval Shipyard. And he stays there for 5 years. He does all the diplomatic connections, all the internal political connections, everything. He builds up the relationships for the U.S. Navy with the power players in the of the Pacific Coast. And this became the repair port. This became the key thing. He actually took him 4 years before he commissioned it. He's out there from 1854, and it's only 1858. He's got enough everything organized, everything built, and he can commission it. And that's important again because this is the US Navy coming of age. This is the point it actually becomes a two-coast navy. I know they've had ships on that coast before. I know they had operations running out from there during the War of 1812 and 1812, 1814 and all that stuff. They did. But honestly, they were making use of the existing facilities. They're making use of the existing place. They didn't have their own infrastructure. They didn't have the facilities they need to actually sustain a naval force. And it's thanks to Farragut they do. And it's becoming a bit of an interesting theme that the senior leaders we've been talking about in this series so far for leadership perspective have all been heavily involved in building the infrastructure needed to support not just their fleet, but future fleet operations. It's almost like there's a common thing that if you're a senior leader, you quickly realise, hang on, to actually have ships available, I need to have the infrastructure to support them. So I better get this built. And that leads us to the Civil War. Now, I will admit, I spent a lot of time on Farragut's wartime service in Live because, like Togo Hayachiro, his experience builds up and then it really comes to a head during the Civil War. There is no surprise to me that up until this war, because of the, well, lack of funding they get for starters, but also the some of the strange American ideas they have over rank structures. The Americans had eschewed the rank of admirals in any way, shape, or form. They preferred flag officer. But this war goes on, you need multiple admirals, you start to need multiple senior officers. And it's appropriate that Farragut is one of the first rear admirals, and then one of the very first vice admirals, and even more senior. He is an experienced officer. He's a capable officer who's built up years and years of experience and years of value. It's also no surprise he joins the North because whilst he might be a son of the South, he was in no way, how do I put this politely, in no way tied to the Southern parties, to some political parties. He views secession as treason. He spent his years of service at sea. He has done countless service serving under the American flag. So yeah, he's born in the South, but he's not of the South. He's of America. It also makes him kind of scary in some ways. And whilst he was not that keen on the idea of going and targeting Norfolk, where he still had friends and relatives, his childhood home of New Orleans, fine. He goes off and does that, and he does it in a decisive manner. One of the things you realise very quickly when you look at his operations is he waits till he's happy with it, and then he goes. He doesn't place much faith in coordinating with the army. Honestly, that seems to work out quite sensibly for him. Whilst the army probably finds it very, very annoying, the army usually has this idea of, we should go at this time because it fits with our marching schedule, and he's going, well, the tides don't fit with that. Well, we have to march it. Well, the tides are far more decisive than the marching. You either have to leave earlier or leave later, but you need to arrive with the right tides for me to be able to get the ships in where I need to get them in. When the army goes, well, that's not what we agreed, he goes, well, I go when the tides go. Navigation and his ability to map and plan and plot his operations, that's what really comes in here. He doesn't always pull it off in the best way. Sometimes he gets himself in his ship trapped. But he's always leading from the front because that's the only real option he has. it's not like you're dealing with some of the major fleets going around this point. If the Royal Navy, he would be the aggressive rear admiral or vice admiral at the front of the operation, with an admiral sitting further back coordinating things and dealing with the politicians for him and making sure the other units are fed in to support him while he does the decisive maneuver. There aren't the senior officers. When he's originally brought back to the Union Navy, after he's sort of, well, not quite retired, but sort of, how do I put this? He'd reached captain. Captain's about as senior as you can get. And there weren't really any other postings for him available. That's the trouble with not having rear admirals, having the admiral ranks. If your officers can only get to captain, they get the captain and then they can go nowhere. You don't want to deploy them to a sea to give them more sea time, because that's going to stop your commanders, and lieutenant commanders getting experience they need to grow up in rank. So literally, once they're a captain, they're almost a spent resource as far as you're concerned in the American system at this time. It's quite embarrassing to think about, really, for a Navy. Especially the size of the greatness the US Navy has become. To think about a time when, honestly, when you got to a captain, you were no longer useful. You had no more future. And that's not because the US Navy didn't need more senior officers. They did. It's because the way Congress was managing the system they've been set up with. But the first thing they brought him back for was to sit on the Naval Retirement Board. Not to serve at sea. No, they brought him back to serve on the Naval Retirement Board to work out who's going to retire and who might be called out of retirement. And then it's his foster brother, David Dixon Porter, who goes, well, we need someone senior for this role, for this mission. My big bro. Call him. He's got tons of experience. Look at who he served under. Not just Dad, but look at all the others he served under. He knows what he's doing. He served under Perry. He served under all the greats of the US naval history. You can't really argue about this. He's the most experienced and qualified officer we have for the job. And I'd argue it really comes to a head once you get to the Battle of Mobile Bay. He's done New Orleans. Mobile is its last place of really Confederate resistance in terms of naval forces in this area, in terms of really making the whole Anaconda plan, as it's so colloquially called, but actually the blockade is the most sensible plan you can be doing. Encirclement and blockade. It's the most sensible and effective plan you can do. But the Anaconda plan is sealed up with the Battle of Mobile Bay. And that's the one where you get the really famous quote coming up. And there's a lot of stuff about the quote. What does he actually say? The thing is, in his lexicon and phraseology at the time, damning the torpedoes, full speed ahead. It's phrased to him, but it probably, if he said anything, it was more likely damn the torpedoes, 4 bells, Captain Traden, go ahead, Jouet, full speed. And that's sending out various orders to various people, both his own flagship captain, his flag, tell them to go to 4 bells, top speed, and sending out messages to other people, including Jouet, who's in charge of the nearest ironclad. And that makes sense. And it makes sense to be moved back. And you have to remember, torpedoes at this point are a name for mine. It's a particular form of fixed anchored mine, but it's called a torpedo. It's not until you get to the Whitehead torpedo that the torpedoes start to evolve into the torpedo we know and love by that phraseology today. The thing is, though, damming the torpedoes full speed ahead, that does kind of sum him up sometimes. He takes the necessary risks. He understands weapons technology. He served in the ordnance department. He has looked after these weapons. He understands their maintenance. He understands the realities of putting them in the water. He knows that after enough time in the water, they're going to get waterlogged and they're not going to work. He's good at taking calculated risks. His entire career has been a process of taking calculated risks and leading by example. And that's what he's doing. He's taking a calculated risk. Yes, he's taking it with je vivre, and all these things. But he's taking a calculated risk. He can afford to say down the torpedoes if they're not going to work. And he's taking the basis that the only ones that are going to go off are the ones which already just went off to take out the ironclad that wandered straight through that minefield. Inappropriately and against his orders. But as they've cleared a hole, they've been a minesweeper. It's rather bad, he's lost the ship, but frankly, he might as well take advantage of it. You're going to get a lot more people killed if you sit there mourning than if you go, well, there's a hole now in the minefield, let's go for it. Because if you get through the minefield, if you get through the torpedoes, on the other side, that's victory. And the quicker you get victory, the more you save the lives of the people you're commanding. The sooner the battle's over, the sooner it's the killing stops. It's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing at all. And he's working with the army in this. He's doing his best with the army. The army don't have enough troops, though, to really deliver on more than the external forts. So everything's really down to the Navy. Everything is down to the Navy. You also have to put the command in the context of if it was given, it actually fits even more with his character, because the captain of the Brooklyn, James Alden, who was the ship in front of the Hartford in the column at the Battle of Mobile Bay, had stopped because he'd lost his monitor, he'd lost his protection, and he was also trying to stay away from the minefield, and he didn't know what to do. Farragut realized that if they stopped and started asking signals and messages going backwards and forwards, that his fleet was going to get slowed down right in the killing zone of the forts. Stopping there gets his ships killed. Charging through the torpedoes, the minefield, winning the battle, that can save a lot of lives. That can win in the battle. Although, saying that, several of the sailors aboard the Union ships did hear clicks, which they felt were torpedo detonators, while they were passing through, but none of them seemed to go off, and they made it through. And once they're through, once they are past that, then you have the clash with the Tennessee, the Confederate ironclad that had taken shelter under the guns of Fort Morgan. But well, they decided the guy in charge of the Tennessee had been the gentleman in charge of an earlier ship. Now Admiral Buchanan, well, he had been captain of the Virginia, which was formerly, of course, the Merrimack, which had fought the Monitor, and had famously used ramming as a critical tactic. And so he seems to have decided that instead of waiting under the fort, despite that's what was where he sort of positioned, he would charge and ram. the force of Farragut. Unfortunately for him, there were three problems with this. One, the Tennessee was slower than her opponents. Two, she actually ends up getting rammed herself, including by the Monongahela, which was fitted with an iron shield on her bow for the purpose of ramming. And whilst those collisions don't actually damage the ironclad in terms of sinking it, and the ramming vessels actually suffer worse, the fact is they do disrupt the engine. They do cause damage. It's a case of, yes, it is not a hole punch in the side, but the impact disrupts the engine. And eventually, along with the misfires and her powder going wrong and all the other issues, Tennessee finds herself having Chickasaw and Manhattan, two of the US Navy monitors, bracketing her. And that's not a fun experience for her. And this kills off Admiral Buchanan. This kills off many of her officers, and she's captured. So, he loses one monitor. He does lose a monitor. But Farragut quickly gains another one, and he does put her into service. What can I say? He's a resourceful gentleman. And after that, well, the forts fall one after the other. Farragut smashing them. Farragut supporting the army to make sure they have overwhelming firepower and to put the forts into a situation where they cannot, well, they really cannot defend themselves. Now, during the battle, this is another piece of fun trivia. Farragut twice decides to go and lash himself in. Well, twice decides to go up the rigging to see what's going on, to get a better view, to try and get a view above the smoke of what's going on, so he can work out what's going on in the battle. And twice he ends up being lashed up there on the orders of Captain Drayton. Now, there's a dispute as to who exactly does it. There's possibly a lieutenant goes up and does it, possibly a sailor. There's also quite a senior NCO sailor, petty officer style officer, who seems to often be attached to Farragut, whose wife had charged him with making sure, the wife of Farragut had charged him with making sure Farragut came home in one piece. My view is certainly the sailor who's often described as doing it was assisting the chief in the first one. But I'm not sure whether the lieutenant did it solo or did it again with the chief's assistant for the second one. There's a whole debate around the sort of different stories around those, and it's a fun piece of history. One of the really interesting things is no one's done a movie about this, not a decent one. Really not a decent. In fact, there hasn't been a single movie which focuses just on David Farragut and his history, which is kind of sad. When you consider how important he is to the US Navy and how often Star Trek has had Farragut's name used. He's a massive part of American culture in so many ways. He turns up in other movies, some of them are historical, some of them are fiction, but he hasn't turned up in a movie about him. Now that's a shame. Because let's be honest, lashing the hero to the mast as there's booms going off around smoke. But to be fair, there aren't many heroes from the American Civil War era who get their just desserts when it comes to the media. There really aren't. Anyway, after the war's over, he carries on. He has other duties. He goes off to the European squadron. He has the USS Franklin, one of the newest ships in the US Navy, as his flagship. And this is appropriate because he did so much of his career in the European squadron, but also it's him being sent out around the world to announce to the world that America is back. We're a force on the world stage. We're here. Know us. See us. Feel us. It's an important statement for America because in many regards, the Civil War is about them coming together as one country, them building themselves up as one country, and laying the groundwork for the infrastructure which we built over the next successive years, next 45, 50 years realistically, and will slowly be rounded off those 20 years following that into an effective system. This is them announcing that they're back, announcing themselves on the world stage, well before the Great White Fleet, well before any of those. Franklin, with Farragut aboard, leading the European squadron, we're here. This is the quality of our ships. Know us. Know our capabilities. And it was a good deployment. So let's consider David Farragut. I've avoided having pictures of him much in this video because, well, I wanted to focus on his experiences. I wanted to focus on his service. I wanted you to not really think of him until you got to the end. He's a complicated soul. He truly is. One of the other troubles you have with Farragut, I suppose, with the modern American model, is that he can seem, at first glance, like the product of nepotism. He really can. Starts off, comes from a naval background, gets adopted by another naval family, grows up thanks to their connections and the connections he makes along the ways, gets a lot of support from other naval officers, gets promoted up, and that can seem absolutely terrible. He's, you can argue, is he a self-made man or is he made by connections? But the thing is, again, you have to go back to the old, the methodologies. People have already been talking in other videos and talking about how their grandparents passed on lessons and their fathers passed on lessons which have helped them in their work. And farming is a good example of this. That's often a family to family generations knowledge of understanding of the land, because whilst you can go and get experience and knowledge at university, and you probably do need it, because considering how complicated farming is these days, and how much technology there is going, and how much science there is into growing it, forecasting crops, soil analysis, goodness gracious me, reading an actual tractor brochure, as I'm going to call it on here, but we all know that's not what I'm talking about in terms of the machinery. That requires practically a degree to understand all the different terminologies in there. And yeah, I'm not a farmer. I have this, to an extent, second hand, skimming through my family members who are farmers, brochures while they're considering making their next multi-million-pound purchase for a combine harvester. It's extortionate. But they have to know every single field. They have to know every single gate. They have to know their land. And that experience, in many ways, is passed down generation by generation to generation. And it's an older way of learning. This is the point. Farragut is a product of the older way of learning. It was perfectly natural amongst the navies in this period for that to be how you got your experience. Because, by the way, you didn't sponsor dullards. If you had someone turn up who was useless, he wasn't getting promoted. The sea would kill him, or he would be persuaded to go off and disappear off somewhere. And there are many ways to persuade an officer to disappear off somewhere. Find a wife who's going to be certainly a land posting of the right social class, and make sure they have a connection and disappear off. Transfer him to the Merchant Marine. Leave him in a foreign port by mistake. There are options. There are options. Or just don't promote him. Don't give him the experience. Don't give him the chances to earn the laurels he needs to get promoted. The thing is about Farragut is, yes, he has a lot of support. He has a lot of promotions thanks to that support. A lot of opportunities thanks to that support. But he also delivers. When he's given an opportunity, he shows up and he does good work. And that's the thing. Over the years, I've developed a sort of policy that, if there are only bad jobs, take them. Do them well. And if it's good, if the company's good, they'll recognize it, they'll value you, they'll promote you. If they don't, you'll know by what time they should have realized if you've been doing hard work. Move on to another job. Use the experience. And it's not easy. Please note, I know it's not easy. I am the king of getting rejected for job applications because I do so much contract work, so much short-term work. I have to put in, as an independent contractor, sometimes I have to put in bids, or rather, this is my CV, please hire me for this short-term role. This is what I do, sort of thing. It's almost even more fun when you've got stuff hidden behind non-disclosure agreements, so you can't really list your work experience. But, again, the opportunities you get often give you a chance for more opportunities. As long as you deliver on them. I'd say I can't really critique Farragut for the way he gets his postings when he's recommended by senior officers who've worked with him and know his capabilities, because now quite a large number of my jobs are people phoning me up or messaging me and going, I work with you on this. I'm now doing this. Could you help me with this? Yeah. Happy to. And again, when you think about it, once you get out of education, once you get into your career at a certain point in the vast majority of careers, that's how it works. Yes, you might stay with a company and be promoted up within the company and all those things, but you also might jump from company to company. It's whatever suits you. It's whatever level of risk you're prepared to take. And yes, that might be open postings, but it might also be, we've got this niche role we need done. You did that niche role there. Oh, you're good. Captain of a naval warship. Commander of a fleet. Someone who has the skill to be diplomatic when they need it. Someone who has the skill to be ruthless when they need it. Someone who has the capabilities to navigate and organize a fleet so it will arrive where it needs to within a timeline. Who understands ordnance, who understands weaponry, who can therefore make sure the infrastructure, which is creaking, bending, groaning at the seams, because it was not designed to support such large forces, will actually function for this fleet. You start thinking of those requirements, and there aren't going to be a lot of people to pick. And then you want someone who you trust absolutely, because this is a civil war. And if you've got someone who is anything less than 100% committed to your side, well, you end up with the scenario which they keep having with the Army of the Potomac. It's always an issue. It's always an issue. And when we go through those criteria, there really aren't a lot of people for the Union to pick from. There really aren't. In fact, Farragut is pretty much the only one who fulfills even 90% of those. He was the sure thing to take and put in charge, realistically. Everyone else you're picking was either doesn't have the same level of experience, hasn't got the same navigation capabilities, hasn't got the same understanding of ordnance, hasn't got the same number. All these things. You are picking them because you haven't got any choice, but realistically, there is no surprise. New Orleans, Mobile, they're important. You send down your best qualified person, your most experienced. It's going to be Farragut. So that's what he really is. He's not so much the product of nepotism as he's the product of experience, of proving his value and his worth. He's a good officer. And when you get into this, well, you have to start considering the legacy, but also you have to consider the question for today. And the question I want to ask you is this. Would Farragut, or any of the other naval heroes you can think of, have a place in your modern navy? Whereas I would argue that Collingwood would fit better in the modern Royal Navy than Nelson, including their duties and roles. Farragut, with his political sense and his skills for engineering and ordnance, and his vast experience, I think he could fit in the modern US Navy. I'm not sure if he'd get recruited by the modern US Navy, but that's because I think he's probably a bit blunt, and he would definitely need to attend a lot more education to get into Annapolis, etc. But I think he'd serve well in the US Navy. You just have to change his childhood. Anyway, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you found it interesting. I'm not sure if this will go live on time this evening, but you know, maybe it does. And if it does, possibly on Twitch when this is over, I'm going to be doing an unboxing of my new table saw. What can I say? And it's Alvaro de Bazin next week. The Marquis de Santa Cruz. Could he really have made the Armada work? Was he really that capable? He has more of a chance than the poor guy who was put in charge of it. We'll leave that one side. Take care, and have a nice day.